Welcome to Midnight Affair Tales, where every story takes you on an unforgettable journey. So, let's dive into today's story. I never thought my life would unravel in whispers. It was a cold night, the kind of night where silence feels thicker, heavier, as though the air itself conspired against you. I had worked late, pushing myself to meet another meaningless deadline. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the soft glow of the balcony light. It was past midnight and there she was, my wife, Amelia, leaning on the railing with a cigarette in hand. That alone was strange. She never smoked. I was about to call out to her when I heard the low murmur of her voice. She was on the phone, her words carried by the chilly breeze, each one a dagger. I should have walked inside, closed the door, and respected her privacy. But something in her tone froze me in place. A high-pitched, cruel laugh escaped her lips. "I mean, seriously, what does he even do?" she said, mockery dripping from every word. "It's like living with a boring roommate. He doesn't inspire me, he doesn't even challenge me. All he does is exist." I felt the ground fall away beneath me. My mind raced to make sense of the venom coming out of her mouth. Who was she talking to? My chest tightened as I sank deeper into the shadows, my heart pounding louder with each second. "No, he has no idea," she continued, her voice tinged with a gleeful cruelty. "I'm practically a saint for staying this long. You're the only thing keeping me sane, babe." The word babe hit me like a slap. I bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from crying out. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was humiliation. She wasn't just cheating, she was mocking me, mocking us, mocking the life we had built together. I don't know how long I stood there, hidden in the darkness, before the call ended. She stubbed out her cigarette, muttered something under her breath, and went inside. For a moment, I stared at the dying ember of her cigarette, glowing faintly in the night. That ember was all I could feel, a small, burning rage that slowly consumed the numbness. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I stayed outside, inhaling the cold air as if it could drown the fury rising in my chest. My hands trembled, not just from the cold but from the realization that my world had just cracked open, spilling secrets I wasn't ready to face. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee untouched, as Amelia breezed in, phone in hand. She looked like the woman I had fallen in love with, vibrant, radiant, and completely at ease. Made me sick. "Good morning," she chirped, barely glancing at me as she scrolled through her messages. I studied her carefully, searching for any sign of remorse, a crack in her facade. But there was nothing. I couldn't hold back any longer. "Who were you talking to last night?" My voice was calm, quieter than I had expected. It seemed to catch her attention. She froze for a moment, her fingers hovering over her phone screen, before recovering with a casual laugh. "What are you talking about?" she asked lightly, raising an eyebrow. "On the balcony," I said. "I heard you." Her brow furrowed slightly before she smirked, a smug, dismissive smirk I was beginning to hate. "Oh, that," she said with a wave of her hand. "I was just catching up with a friend." "What? Is that a crime now?" The lie rolled off her tongue so effortlessly it made my stomach churn. "A friend," I repeated, gripping my coffee cup tightly. "You were mocking me, mocking our marriage?" "Oh, for God's sake, don't be so dramatic," she snapped, rolling her eyes. "It was just girl talk. We all need to vent sometimes. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Girl talk?" I echoed, my voice rising. "You called him babe? You said I don't inspire you, that I'm just existing. Who is he, Amelia?" Her irritation bubbled to the surface. "You're unbelievable, you know that," she said, her voice sharp. "I've spent years supporting you, enduring your endless routines, your boring job, and the one time I vent, you act like I committed a crime." "You did commit a crime," I shot back, my words cutting like a knife. "Did you commit a crime, Amelia? Because lying to my face, treating me like I'm nothing, that's criminal." Her face flushed with anger, and for a moment I thought she might explode. But instead, she pivoted, her voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. "Do you want to know why I'm so unhappy, Mark?" she shouted. "You sit there day after day pretending to be the perfect husband, but you're not. You let this marriage rot while you drowned yourself in work and acted like everything was fine." Her words hit deeper than I thought they could. I wanted to defend myself, to remind her of the sacrifices I had made, the times I had tried to get closer to her, only to be met with her indifference. But I didn't. Because deep down I knew it wasn't about me. "Don't twist this around," I said, my voice low and steady. You're the one who stepped out, not me. You're the one who chose to betray what we had." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Oh, spare me. People cheat all the time, Mark. Maybe if you'd been half the man I needed, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." The air seemed to leave the room. Her cruelty was breathtaking, a final nail in the coffin of whatever love I had left for her. I pushed back my chair and stood, towering over her. "I hope he was worth it," I said quietly, turning toward the door. "Where are you going?" she demanded, her tone more mocking than concerned. I didn't answer. I grabbed my keys and walked out, the sound of the door slamming behind me ringing in my ears. As I drove aimlessly through the streets, the realization struck me: I wasn't running away. I was preparing my escape. I didn't go far that day. I parked my car on an empty street and sat there, gripping the steering wheel as though it was the only thing holding me together. My mind raced, flipping through moments from our marriage, the happy times, the fights, the silences that had grown like cracks in our foundation. I tried to pinpoint the moment everything began to fall apart, but the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what came next. The first step was gathering proof. I wasn't going to let her twist this around, to manipulate the narrative like she always did. If I was going to leave, I needed to ensure she couldn't drag me through the mud on my way out. I called an old friend, Tim, who was an attorney. He had helped me with a work contract dispute in the past. He picked up quickly, his voice warm but cautious. "Mark, what's going on? It's been a while." "I need a divorce lawyer," I said bluntly, cutting straight to the point. There was a pause. "Mark, you want to tell me what happened?" Tim asked, his tone careful. The words felt heavy, as though saying them aloud would make them too real. "She's cheating on me," I finally admitted. "I need to know how to protect myself." Tim didn't press for details. Instead, he launched into a clear, clinical explanation of what I needed to do, what to document, how to stay calm, and what steps to take to ensure a clean break. His words were cold but necessary, exactly what I needed to hear. When I hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't going to let her hysteria, her venom, or her lies pull me into the chaos she thrived on. I was going to handle this my way. That night, I returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. Amelia was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. She barely looked up when I walked in. "Where did you run off to?" she asked, her tone more mocking than curious. "Work," I lied smoothly. "I needed to clear my head." She shrugged, returning her attention to her phone. It was then that I realized something that should have been obvious all along. She didn't care. Not about me, not about us. What we had once shared was long gone, and I was the only one still holding on. In the days that followed, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I didn't confront her again. I didn't argue. I didn't demand answers. Instead, I watched. Late at night, when she thought I was asleep, I listened to her laughter on the phone, her voice low and conspiratorial. She was careful not to leave any obvious evidence, but I didn't need much to confirm what I already knew. One evening, she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for: emails, messages, tiny fragments of her double life. I didn't read all of them. The pieces I did see were enough to make my stomach turn. The words burned themselves into my brain, but I didn't let the anger take over. Instead, I took screenshots, saved the files, and emailed them to myself. Proof, a lifeline for when the storm finally hit. As I closed the laptop, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the darkened window. I didn't recognize the man staring back at me, cold, calculating, and unflinching. I was afraid, but I also felt stronger. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was taking control. That night, as Amelia slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind wasn't clouded by anger or betrayal anymore. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom. Over the next few weeks, I moved quietly. I began transferring small items out of the house: personal documents, sentimental belongings, anything I didn't want caught up in the inevitable chaos. I rented a storage unit under a name Amelia wouldn't recognize, a lifeboat I was constructing while pretending to enjoy the cruise. At night, her words from the balcony replayed in my mind. The way she had laughed at me, mocked me, turned me into a joke for her lover. It wasn't just betrayal, it was contempt. And yet I stayed silent. I knew that if I reacted too soon, she would twist it into a weapon against me. She was good at that, bending the truth until it broke. One evening, I came home to find her lounging on the couch, a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said lightly, her tone almost inquisitive. "What's going on?" I shrugged, forcing a small smile. "Work's been keeping me busy, you know how it is." She studied me for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Well, don't let it get to you. You've been tense." The irony was almost laughable. Tense, of course I was tense. I was living with a stranger who wore the face of my wife, preparing an exit she didn't even see coming. But I swallowed my frustration and nodded. "I'll try to relax," I said, heading to the kitchen before she could ask any more questions. But her behavior began to shift. She grew cautious. She was still sneaking around, but I could tell she was becoming suspicious of me. She started asking more questions, testing the waters to see if I had figured anything out. One night, as we sat down to dinner, she said, "You've been working late a lot. Is everything okay?" "Yeah," I replied casually, keeping my tone light. "Big project coming up?" She nodded but didn't press further. Still, I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of doubt, the faint shadow of paranoia. She didn't know what I knew, but she could sense that something was off. The real turning point came about a week later when I overheard her on the phone again. This time she wasn't laughing. Her voice was high-pitched and anxious. "I don't know," she said. "He's been acting weird lately. He's distant. I think he knows something." There was a pause, followed by a faint murmur I couldn't make out. Her response sent a chill down my spine. "Well, if he does, I'll handle it. He's too much of a coward to do anything drastic." Coward. That word echoed in my mind long after she hung up. It wasn't just an insult, it was a challenge. She thought she knew me, thought I would lie down and let her walk away unscathed. But she was wrong. That night, as I sat alone in the spare bedroom that had become my refuge, I realized something important. I didn't just want to leave this marriage, I wanted to reclaim my dignity, my identity. For too long, I had let her define me, her words, her actions, her betrayals. I didn't want that anymore. The next morning I called Tim again. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady. With Tim's guidance, I began laying the groundwork for the divorce. It felt like moving chess pieces on a board, each step deliberate and calculated. I documented everything: screenshots, overheard conversations, subtle changes in her behavior. I knew I had to stay one step ahead, especially now that she suspected something was amiss. Amelia, true to form, wasn't going to let anything slip from her grasp without a fight. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic. Some days she was overly kind, attempting to pull me back in with forced affection and half-hearted gestures to gauge my mood. Other days she was cold, distant, her words laced with the venom she usually reserved for those who dared to challenge her. One evening, after another tense dinner, she cornered me in the kitchen. Arms crossed, her face a mask of irritation, she demanded, "You're acting strange. If something's going on, just say it." I turned to her, keeping my expression calm. "I don't know what you mean," I said. "I've just been busy." Her eyes narrowed. "Busy with what? You come home late, barely talk to me, and don't seem like yourself anymore. Are you hiding something, Mark?" The irony of her accusation nearly made me laugh, but I held my ground. "I'm not hiding anything," I replied firmly. "But maybe you're projecting." For a moment her mask slipped. Panic flashed across her face before she quickly recovered, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "Projecting? That's rich," she said, her tone sharp. "For someone who claims to be so trustworthy, you've been awfully secretive." I didn't take the bait. Instead, I shrugged and brushed past her, leaving her standing there, furious. Every interaction felt like walking through a minefield, but I refused to let her pull me into a fight I couldn't win. The following day I made my first major move. I opened a separate bank account and transferred half of our shared savings into it. It wasn't much, just enough to cover legal fees and a few months of living expenses. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a small victory in a battle that had barely begun. That night, Amelia seemed unusually cheerful. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled on the couch, smiling as though everything was fine. "Guess what?" she said, her tone light and playful. "What?" I asked cautiously. "I booked us a weekend getaway. Just the two of us. I thought it might be nice to reconnect." I studied her, trying to discern her intentions. Was this a genuine attempt to save our marriage, or just another one of her manipulative games? Either way, I knew better than to fall for it. That's thoughtful, I said carefully. But I don't think I can take time off work right now. She sighed dramatically, taking a sip of her wine. Of course not. Work always comes first, doesn't it? The accusation hung in the air, but I didn't respond. Instead, I nodded and left the room, already planning my next steps. Her sudden generosity wasn't a coincidence, it was a test, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of passing. That night as I lay in bed, I realized something else. Her games and manipulations were starting to backfire. Every move she made only strengthened my resolve to leave. And when the time came, I wouldn't just walk away, I'd do it on my terms, with my dignity intact. The following week felt like living in a pressure cooker. Amelia's anger simmered just below the surface, boiling over in unexpected moments. She began disappearing for hours during the day, returning late at night without offering any explanation. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Every time she walked through the door, the faint scent of someone else's cologne lingered in the air. But her erratic behavior wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. Amelia started playing the victim, carefully constructing a narrative in which she was the one being wronged. She suddenly became very sociable, inviting mutual friends over for coffee or drinks and making a show of how difficult things were for her. One evening, I walked into the living room to find her sitting with two of our friends, a tissue clutched in her hand as she dabbed at imaginary tears. It's just been so hard, she said, her voice trembling with calculated vulnerability. Mark has been so. I don't even know what I did wrong. They turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of sympathy and confusion. I felt a spark of anger but forced myself to remain calm. Can I speak with you for a moment? I asked, keeping my tone polite but firm. Amelia's lips curled into a satisfied smile as she stood. Of course, she said sweetly, following me into the kitchen. What are you doing? I demanded as soon as we were out of earshot. She crossed her arms, her expression shifting to feigned innocence. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean, I said, my voice low. Stop dragging other people into this. Her eyes narrowed and for a moment the mask fell away. What's the matter, Mark? Afraid people will start seeing the truth? I stared at her, the weight of her manipulation pressing down on me. The truth will come out, I said finally. You might want to think about which side you want to be on. She didn't respond. Instead, she smiled, a cold, calculated smile, before turning and walking back into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, gripping the counter and trying to steady my breathing. The next morning, I called Tim to update him on the situation. She's trying to spin a new story, I said. Some of our friends already believe she's the victim. That's not unusual, Tim replied. People like her thrive on control, and when they start to lose it, they'll do anything to get it back. Focus on the facts. The evidence you've gathered will speak for itself. His words offered some comfort, but they didn't erase the growing tension. Each day felt like a battle and I was exhausted from fighting. But I knew I couldn't let my guard down, not yet. Later that week, Amelia made her boldest move yet. I came home from work to find a police officer standing on our porch. My stomach sank as I approached, dreading whatever she had concocted this time. Mr. Longston? The officer asked, glancing at his clipboard. Yes, I said cautiously. What's going on? We received a call from your wife, he said, his tone neutral. She said she doesn't feel safe and asked us to check in on the situation. I blinked, stunned by her audacity. Not safe? I repeated. I haven't done anything. The officer raised a hand. I'm just here to make sure everything is okay. May I come in and ask a few questions? Amelia appeared in the doorway, her face a perfect mask of worry. Oh, thank you so much for coming, she said, her voice trembling. I've just been so scared lately. It took everything in me not to explode. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm as the officer asked his questions. I answered honestly, knowing I had nothing to hide. After a thorough but thankfully professional discussion, the officer left. His demeanor suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Amelia's performance, but the damage was done. She had planted the seed of doubt, and she knew it. As I closed the door behind him, I turned to her, my voice cold. Is that your plan? To make me out as the bad guy? She shrugged, her lips curling into a smug smile. It's not my fault if people believe what they see. I stared at her, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a failed marriage, it was a war. The incident with the police officer was a wake-up call. Amelia wasn't just playing games anymore, she was escalating. I had to be prepared for whatever she might throw at me next. The first thing I did the following morning was call Tim. "She's trying to build a case against me," I said, recounting the police visit. She called them and made it sound like I was some sort of threat. Tim's voice was calm but firm. "This is classic manipulation, Mark. She's laying the groundwork for a false narrative. The good news is you've documented everything, haven't you?" "I have," I confirmed. "But what should I do now?" "Stay calm," he advised. "Don't react to her provocations even if it's tempting. Install security cameras in your house, especially in common areas. Make sure everything is recorded. That way, if she tries to make false accusations, you'll have proof to back yourself up." The idea of cameras in my home felt invasive, but I knew it was necessary. That evening, I discreetly installed small cameras in the living room, kitchen, and hallway. If Amelia wanted to outsmart me, I wasn't going to make it easy for her. The next few days were a test of patience. Amelia alternated between hostility and performative vulnerability. Her actions were calculated to provoke a reaction, leaving messes in the kitchen and accusing me of being controlling when I asked her to clean up, slamming doors after coming home late, and then claiming my anger was intimidating. I refused to take the bait. I documented every word, every action, knowing it might be vital later. One evening, as I reviewed the footage from the cameras, I overheard her on the phone again. Her voice was low and conspiratorial. "He's trying to trap me," she said. "I know he is. He's been too quiet, too calculated. But don't worry, I'll make sure the judge sees who he really is." The faint voice on the other end asked something, and her response sent a chill down my spine. "Do you think he'll fight for the house?" she asked, laughing bitterly. "Probably. But it doesn't matter. I'll spin this so hard he won't know what hit him." Her words were chilling. She wasn't just trying to escape the marriage, she wanted to destroy me in the process. But she had underestimated me. For years, I had been the quiet, accommodating husband, letting her control the narrative. That was no longer the case. The following morning, I met with Tim in person to strategize. "She's going to try to smear me," I said. "I've heard her talking about it. What can we do?" Tim leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "The evidence you've gathered is solid," he said. "The footage will back you up if she makes false claims. We'll file temporary orders to protect your assets and ensure you maintain access to the house. Let her throw her accusations, she won't have anything to support them." I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. For the first time, it felt like I wasn't just reacting. I was taking control. That evening, Amelia confronted me again. She stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom, arms crossed, her eyes cold. "So, are we just going to keep pretending everything's fine?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I'm not pretending," I said calmly. "I'm done pretending." Her eyes narrowed. "You really think you're going to get out of this unscathed?" "I think the truth will come out," I replied, meeting her gaze. "And I'm ready for it." Her expression faltered for just a moment before she turned and walked away. I closed the door, my heart pounding but my determination unwavering. This wasn't just about leaving her. It was about reclaiming myself no matter the cost. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal meetings, tense standoffs, and carefully controlled chaos. Amelia's antics only grew more elaborate as the reality of the divorce set in. She started posting cryptic messages on social media, sharing photos of herself looking despondent with captions like, "When you give your all, but it's never enough." I didn't respond. I let her have her performance. I was playing the long game. When the day of our first court hearing arrived, it felt like a surreal moment. It wasn't the final trial but a preliminary session to establish temporary orders regarding our assets and living arrangements. I walked into the courtroom with Tim by my side, armed with documents, evidence, and a quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. Amelia, of course, made a dramatic entrance. She wore an expression of solemnity, her eyes darting around as though she wanted to make sure everyone noticed her pain. Her lawyer, a sharp-looking man with an air of calculated arrogance, stood beside her. The hearing began, and her lawyer wasted no time painting me as the villain. He spoke of her emotional suffering, her fear for her safety, and the hostile environment I had supposedly created in our home. Amelia nodded along, even dabbing at her eyes with a tissue for added effect. When it was Tim's turn, he presented the evidence calmly and methodically. He played excerpts from the audio recordings and showed footage from the cameras. Her late-night calls, her mocking words, and even her attempts to provoke me. As the truth unfolded, the judge's expression shifted from skepticism to understanding. When Tim finished, the courtroom fell silent, save for the sound of Amelia shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Then the moment I had been waiting for came. "Your Honor," Tim said, "it's clear that my client has acted in good faith throughout this process. He has gathered indisputable evidence of infidelity and manipulative behavior. We ask that he retain access to the marital home and that the court consider the emotional and financial toll this situation has taken on him." The judge nodded thoughtfully, turning her gaze to Amelia. "Mrs. Longston, do you have anything to say in response to this evidence?" Amelia hesitated, her carefully constructed mask cracking. "This isn't fair," she stammered. "He's been spying on me, it's an invasion of privacy." The judge's voice was firm as she replied, "Behavior within your marital home is not protected from documentation, Mrs. Longston. And based on what I've seen, I'm inclined to side with Mr. Longston. Temporary possession of the home is granted to him until this matter is resolved." The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the room, and I felt a weight lift from my chest. Amelia's face was a mixture of shock and fury, but she said nothing as we exited the courtroom. I could feel her gaze burning into my back as Tim and I walked away. That evening, as I sat alone in what now felt like my home again, I let out a long breath. It wasn't over yet. There were still agreements to negotiate, final hearings to attend. But I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. For the first time in years, I felt free. The morning after the court hearing, I woke up feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. The temporary court orders had granted me possession of the house, but I knew Amelia wouldn't give up so easily. Her venomous message from the night before still lingered in my mind, "You're going to regret this." Despite her threats, I had no regrets. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life. I started the day by finalizing a few practical steps. Following Tim's advice, I closed our shared credit cards and redirected my paycheck to the separate account I had opened. Every action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, one small victory at a time. That evening, Amelia returned home later than usual. She walked into the house with her usual flair, tossing her bag onto the couch and pouring herself a glass of wine. Her expression was guarded, but there was a fire in her eyes, a burning resentment that she didn't bother to hide. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, calmly going through some papers. Silence, I'd learned, was my most powerful weapon against her. "Don't ignore me, Mark," she snapped, slamming her glass onto the counter. "You're not as clever as you think. This isn't over." I looked up, meeting her glare with an even gaze. "You're right, Amelia. It's not over. But it will be soon." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "You're pathetic," she spat. "Trying to play the victim while you tear apart everything we've built." "I'm not playing the victim," I said evenly. "I'm just done playing your games." Her laughter was sharp and bitter. "My games? You're the one who's turned this into a circus, Mark. You've been spying on me, hoarding money, and running to your lawyer like a coward." I stood, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I did what I had to do to protect myself. You made your choices, Amelia. Now you have to live with them." She stared at me for a long moment, her face twisting with anger and something that looked like fear. Then, without another word, she stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. In the days that followed, Amelia's behavior grew more erratic. She alternated between icy silence and explosive outbursts, trying to bait me into a fight. But I refused to engage. Instead, I focused on finalizing the details of the divorce with Tim, gathering every piece of evidence I could to ensure a fair outcome. One afternoon, as I was organizing files in the spare bedroom, Amelia burst in, her face flushed with fury. "You're going to regret this, Mark," she hissed. "I'll make sure of it." I didn't flinch. "Do whatever you need to do, Amelia," I said calmly. "But this ends on my terms." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she turned on her heel and walked out, slamming the door behind her. That evening, I found myself replaying the events of the past few months. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, it all felt like a lifetime ago. But as painful as it had been, I realized that I had grown stronger. I wasn't the same man who had stood frozen in the shadows, listening to her mockery on the balcony. I was ready to move forward. The day of the final court hearing arrived sooner than I had expected. I walked into the courtroom with Tim by my side, armed with months of evidence and a quiet determination. Amelia was already there, seated at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer. She looked composed, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The proceedings were long and exhausting. Amelia's lawyer tried to paint her as the victim, accusing me of being controlling and uncooperative. But Tim countered every claim with cold, hard facts: recordings, messages, financial statements. The truth was undeniable. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders. The marital assets were divided fairly, and I retained possession of the house. Amelia's claims of emotional distress were dismissed, her manipulations laid bare for all to see. As we left the courtroom, Tim turned to me with a rare smile. "You did well, Mark," he said. "It's not easy to come out of something like this with your dignity intact." I nodded, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. "Thanks, Tim. For everything." That evening I returned home to a quiet, empty house. Amelia had already moved out, taking her belongings and leaving behind only the memories of what we had once shared. I stood in the living room, taking in the silence, and felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. It wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. As I sat down with a glass of wine, I thought about everything I had been through. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight for my own sense of self. It had all been worth it. Because now I was free. Free to rebuild my life, to rediscover who I was, and to finally let go of the past. And as I raised my glass to the empty room, I made a silent promise to myself: I would never let anyone take my peace away again. The house felt emptier than ever after Amelia left. Her absence, once something I had dreaded, now brought a strange sense of peace. For years, I had been weighed down by her presence, her manipulations, and her constant need to control everything. Now the silence felt like a clean slate, a chance to start over. Over the following days, I began the process of reclaiming my life. I went room by room, removing the remnants of her influence. Photos, trinkets, and even furniture she had chosen, I packed it all up and set it aside. It was cathartic, like exorcising the ghosts of a life I no longer wanted. One evening, as I was boxing up some of her things, I came across an old photo album. It was from the early days of our marriage, filled with pictures of us smiling, laughing, and looking impossibly happy. I flipped through it slowly, feeling a pang of sadness for the people we used to be. Somewhere along the way we had lost ourselves, and I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been inevitable. But dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. I closed the album and added it to the pile of things I planned to donate. I couldn't carry those memories with me, they belonged to another life, one that no longer existed. As the days turned into weeks, I started focusing on myself for the first time in years. I reconnected with old friends, some of whom I had lost touch with because of Amelia's controlling nature. I started going to the gym, rediscovering the simple joy of taking care of my body and mind. It was as if I was piecing myself back together bit by bit. One afternoon, Tim called to check in. "How's it going, Mark?" he asked. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "It's strange though. For so long, I thought I'd be devastated if she left. But now, I just feel relieved." Tim chuckled softly. "That's normal. You've been carrying the weight of that relationship for years. It's going to take time to adjust, but you're on the right track." We talked for a while, discussing the final steps of the divorce and what to expect in the coming months. It was a practical conversation, but it left me feeling optimistic. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. A few weeks later, I ran into an old friend, Jake, at a coffee shop. We hadn't seen each other in years, but the conversation flowed easily as if no time had passed. When I told him about the divorce, he shook his head sympathetically. "Man, I always thought something was off with her," he said bluntly. "She had this, I don't know, this vibe like she was always playing a game." I laughed, surprised by his honesty. "Yeah, well, you were right. But it's over now and I'm moving on." Jake raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To new beginnings then. Let's catch up more often. It's good to see you smiling again." That evening, as I sat in the quiet of my house, I thought about Jake's words. For so long, I had felt trapped, as if happiness was something I could only glimpse from a distance. But now it felt within reach, something I could claim for myself. One of the biggest surprises came a few months later when I met someone new. Her name was Claire, and she was nothing like Amelia. She was warm, kind, and refreshingly honest. We met at a mutual friends gathering, and our conversation flowed effortlessly. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of genuine connection. At first, I was hesitant. The wounds from my marriage were still fresh, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to open myself up again. But Claire was patient, never pushing me beyond what I was comfortable with. She listened without judgment when I shared pieces of my past, and her empathy was a balm to my still healing heart. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship grew stronger. It wasn't perfect, no relationship ever is, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. Claire reminded me of what love could be when it wasn't tainted by manipulation and deceit. Looking back, I realized that my marriage to Amelia had taught me valuable lessons. It had shown me the importance of setting boundaries, of standing up for myself, and of never settling for less than I deserved. Those lessons, painful as they were, had shaped me into the person I was becoming, a stronger, wiser version of myself. One evening, as Claire and I sat on the back porch of my house, watching the sunset, she turned to me with a soft smile. "You've been through so much, Mark," she said, "but you've come out of it stronger. That's something to be proud of." I nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude for her presence in my life. "I couldn't have done it without people like you," I said. "Thank you for being here, for showing me what's possible." She reached for my hand, her touch grounding me in the moment. "You deserve happiness, Mark. Don't ever forget that." As I looked out at the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The past was behind me, and while it had left its scars, it had also paved the way for something new. I was no longer defined by my mistakes or by the pain of my failed marriage. I was free to create a future that was truly my own. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that future was bright. Months turned into a year, and life slowly began to feel normal again, or perhaps better than normal. The pain and chaos that had consumed me during my marriage to Amelia had faded into the background, replaced by a sense of calm and purpose. I was no longer just surviving, I was living. The house, once a battleground of deceit and manipulation, had become a sanctuary. I filled it with things that brought me joy, art I loved, furniture that felt like me, and small touches that made it feel like a true home. Each addition was a step toward reclaiming my identity, toward building a life that felt authentically mine. My relationship with Claire continued to blossom. She wasn't just a partner, she was a friend, someone who supported me without trying to control me. With her, everything felt different, lighter, freer. I didn't have to second-guess her words or decipher hidden meanings. She was honest and kind, and for the first time in years I felt truly seen. One evening, as we prepared dinner together in the kitchen, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not in the way I used to, though. It's more like a distant memory. Something that shaped me but doesn't define me anymore." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's a good way to look at it. I just hope you know how far you've come, Mark. You should be proud of yourself." Her words stayed with me long after she left that night. She was right, I had come a long way. The person I was now barely resembled the man who had stood frozen on the driveway, listening to his wife mock him to her lover. That man had been broken, unsure of his worth. But I had rebuilt myself piece by piece, and in the process, I had discovered a strength I didn't know I possessed. One day, I received an unexpected email from Tim. The divorce case had been officially closed, and all remaining legal matters were settled. As I read his words, I felt a surge of relief. It was over. Truly over. The chapter of my life that had been defined by Amelia's betrayal and manipulation was finally behind me. To mark the occasion, I decided to take a trip, a solo journey to a place I had always wanted to visit but never had the chance to. I booked a flight to the Pacific Northwest, drawn by the promise of serene landscapes and quiet reflection. It felt like the perfect way to celebrate my newfound freedom. The trip was everything I had hoped for. I hiked through lush forests, stood in awe of towering waterfalls, and sat by the ocean, listening to the waves crash against the shore. It was a reminder of how vast and beautiful the world could be, a stark contrast to the small, stifling life I had lived with Amelia. One evening, as I watched the sun set over the water, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. For so long, I had carried the weight of anger and hurt, letting it dictate my actions and my thoughts. But in that moment, I realized I didn't need to hold on to it anymore. It was time to let go. When I returned home, I felt lighter, as though a burden I hadn't fully realized I was carrying had been lifted. I threw myself into my work, my hobbies, and my relationship with Claire. Life wasn't perfect, it never is, but it was good. And that was more than enough. One day, while cleaning out an old drawer, I came across a letter Amelia had written to me during the early years of our marriage. In it, she had written about her dreams for our future, her hopes for our life together. As I read her words, I felt a pang of sadness, not for her but for the people we had been. We had started with so much promise only to lose our way. But instead of dwelling on what could have been, I folded the letter and placed it in a box of other keepsakes from that time. It wasn't something I needed to hold on to anymore, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was a part of my story after all, a reminder of how far I had come. As time went on, I found myself thinking less and less about Amelia. She became a distant figure, someone who had once loomed large in my life but no longer held any power over me. I didn't know where she was or what she was doing, and I realized I didn't care. My life was my own now, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as Claire and I sat on the porch watching the stars, she turned to me with a question. "Do you ever regret it? Any of it?" I shook my head, a small smile playing on my lips. "No," I said. "It was hard and it hurt like hell, but it taught me so much. About myself, about what I want and what I deserve. I wouldn't be where I am now without it." She nodded, squeezing my hand. "I'm glad you're here," she said softly. "And I'm glad I get to be part of this chapter with you." As I looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had taken me through some dark and painful places, but it had also brought me to this moment. A moment of peace, love, and hope for the future. The story of my marriage to Amelia was over, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. One where I was free to be myself, to love and be loved, and to live a life that felt truly my own. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt truly, undeniably happy.